Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of LAC. Today's episode is appropriately titled Dialogue the Second, and if you are tuning in with us this evening / morning / afternoon / time outside of time, it's probably because you missed class for one reason or another. No shame, no shade, but here we are together enjoying yet another episode digitally. All right, let's get started. First, we'll start with some housekeeping. Many of you, I think, were a little confused about em dashes. That is the long dash that we discussed in our dialogue class on punctuation that you use to cut off sentences abruptly. Many of you used hyphens, so little tiny dashes instead of em dashes, which are a long em dash. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you the trick to getting an em dash to appear when you need to abruptly cut off a sentence in the midst of dialogue. What you're going to do is you're going to write your first word, you're going to hit the hyphen button twice, and then you're going to type the next word and do a space. So word, hyphen, hyphen, word, space, and it should just automatically transform it into an em dash. This should also work with end quotation marks or whatnot. Just for reference, anytime you need to make one of these long dashes instead of one of the short dashes, you should be able to use a hyphen twice. I know it automatically adjusts into an em dash in Microsoft Word. It automatically does that on my iPhone when I'm using it to type. And I'm guessing it'll automatically do it for you in Google Docs if you are typing into Google Docs from a computer. I don't know this for sure, but I am guessing. All right, so that is housekeeping about em dashes. Second of all, we are going to discuss a little bit of MLA format. Primarily, I would need you to be putting your names on your papers. I did have multiple papers turned in that had no names, which is a bit confusing, you must confess, for the poor graders. Now you may be saying, well, but my name is on my folder, but I'm going to let you into a little secret of grading LAC. When you turn in that folder, the teachers take it, they empty it out, and they split it into literature and writing homework, and it does get graded separately. So I will need from now on your name on all of your papers. Second of all, I need you to be using indents at the beginning of every single paragraph. If you are writing in Microsoft Word, you can set Word to automatically do indents for you. With every paragraph, it should just be in your paragraph settings. If you have the ruler up on display, you can also use it to change your indents. If not, you can hit tab at the beginning of every paragraph. It is easier in general to figure out how to make your word processor do this automatically, just so you don't have to worry about it. But I do need you to be indenting the beginning of every paragraph, dialogue included. Second of all, I'm going to ask you from now on to be using Times New Roman 12-point font just for consistency and readability's sake. And also on a similar vein, I would ask you to double space everything. Now, in my own personal life, I do prefer 1.5 spacing. However, when I am writing comments on someone else's essays or stories, it's a lot easier to write comments when I have more space to write. So that is why we're asking you to make double spaces. Now, this should be something actually that you rejoice in if you are an average student, because when I was an average student, I really liked double spacing because that meant I could reach page count limits much quicker than if they asked me to single space or to 1.5 space. Now, if you are sad that you can't fit as much into every page, I don't actually have page maximums. I have page minimums. Now, I may have to say something if you are giving me way too much work, but I am somehow suspecting that that is not going to be an issue. All right, next, on to pronouns and epithets. These are two different bullet points, but they are do want to talk about them together. One thing that we noticed while grading your stories this past week was quite a few of you had some confusing sentences, which shouldn't have been confusing except for your use of pronouns. So we wrote a very silly sentence here to exaggeratedly demonstrate our point. All right. He hit him in his face. He burst into tears and asked him to leave. What was he thinking? How could he have asked him such a rude question? Now, admittedly, this sentence sentences were intended to be a little more confusing than average, but I think it demonstrates my point. And my point is, when you use the same pronoun for the multiple characters in the same sentence and paragraph and never go back and use the characters' names, it can be very easy to lose track of who is doing what and who is thinking what. This can also be an issue if you have a man and a woman talking, but it is more of an issue when you have two women or two men talking, because they're using, of course, the same pronouns. So he hit him in his face. We can kind of figure out this one. He burst into tears and asked him to leave. This is a little less clear. Is the person who hit him or the person who was hit bursting into tears and asking him to leave? I think you could argue validly that it could be either. It is unclear. So I'm going to ask you to watch your pronoun usage and try as much as possible to be using character names in order to clear up any pronoun confusions. If you have questions about it, you might be feeling, oh, but I feel like I use the characters' names too often. You can always ask someone to read over your paper and tell you whether it's confusing or not. Now, as a way of trying to solve this problem, you may be tempted to start using epithets. Now, if you are one of the students who read the Odyssey, you should be very familiar with the epithets as a terminology. The most famous epithet in all of literature, of course, is gray-eyed Athena from the Odyssey. An epithet is, in general, a nickname that is used in addition to or in place of a character's name. And we have another silly sentence for you to demonstrate what our point about epithets is. I'm going to read it first. The young, fresh-faced girl walked into her mother's kitchen. The fresh-faced girl smiled. Her mother greeted the fresh-faced girl and complimented her on her fresh face. Now, the fresh-faced girl is this character's epithet. We are using it in place of her name. If her name is Sally, we are not saying Sally walked into her mother's kitchen. We are saying the fresh-faced girl walked into the mother's kitchen. Once again, this can be tempting to start doing when you are trying not to use so many pronouns and not to use the character's name so many times. It can seem like a good solution, but what I am warning you now is that it can very quickly start to sound silly. There are appropriate times to give characters nicknames, such as if one character, the viewpoint character, whoever your main character is, if they don't know another character's name, then it is appropriate to go ahead and give them a nickname. This is the most useful when you are writing especially fight scenes. For example, if you are writing a mystery story and your detective is starting to uncover things that people don't want to be uncovered, and let's say he is walking home late one night and walking through an alley and is then approached by a group of men who then begin to attack him. It's very convenient to quickly give all of the attackers a nickname. So even though the main character, our detective, doesn't know who's fighting him, we can keep track of who is punching who is being kicked, who is having their teeth knocked out, and etc. So you can have the man with the beard throw the first punch, and you can call him Beard Man or whatever. It just depends on the tone of the story, what nickname you give him, but that is an appropriate use of epithets. But in general, I'm just forewarning you that in solving your pronoun problem, don't overcorrect into causing slightly silliness problems with overuse of epithets. All right, enough with the housekeeping. Let's talk more about dialogue. Dialogue is one of my favorite parts of writing. It is my favorite sort of scene to write and my favorite sort of scene to read, if I am honest. But what is a dialogue? So, I pulled these definitions straight from Google. So there are 6 of them. So 1, a dialogue is a conversation between 2 or more people. 2, A discussion of positions or beliefs, especially between groups to resolve a disagreement. 3. Conversation between characters in a drama or narrative. 4. The lines or passages in a script that are intended to be spoken. 5. A literary work written in the form of a conversation, such as the dialogues of Plato. 6. A composition or passage for 2 or more parts, suggestive of conversational interplay. Now, the word dialogue comes from Greek theater, and where it is juxtaposed against a monologue. Monologue being one person talking. A dialogue then is 2 people talking. When it's used today, it's generally used to refer to 2 or more characters talking, or the actual lines that are spoken aloud. So if you can see sort of in that number 4, where the lines or passages in a script that are intended to be spoken. And so we often use dialogue to refer to actual spoken words by a character or multiple characters discussing something or talking about something, saying something. All right, what makes up a dialogue? So, there are 3 main parts of a dialogue. The first one is the words said by a character. So this is also sometimes just called dialogue. These are the actual words. These are the parts in the dialogue that are going to go inside of the quotation marks. And my example is, do you want to come to the market with me? Inside the quotation marks, these are the actual words that a character is saying. So again, these are the words said by a character, and sometimes people will just call this dialogue. All right, 2, dialogue tags. Dialogue tags are the he said, she said, or any other character connected to, in general, a verb that describes sound coming out of someone's mouth, with very few exceptions. It's going to be asked, it's going to be said, it's going to be grumbled or whispered or shouted or yelled or exclaimed or questioned or countered. Any of these verbs that describe someone speaking, talking, or making other verbal noises that then convey words. So the exceptions are things like, generally it's not recommended to use giggled, for example, as a verb in a dialogue tag, mostly because it's difficult to giggle and talk at the same time. You might be able to manage a word or 2 while giggling, but in general, a whole sentence is beyond most people in the midst of giggling. Now, you might say, it's probably better to say if you're describing someone giggling and talking, like going back and forth, which is a little bit more common, have giggles and words, and then a little bit more giggles and then words, to describe, say something like, I can't believe you fell for it, he said while giggling, or he giggled, I can't believe you fell for it. 2 different sentences, and then he said is the dialogue tag. All right, and then number 3, the last aspect of dialogue that I am going to talk about is action beats. So the example is, do you want to come to the market with me? Yarrow asked. She picked up her market basket from beside the door and checked it for holes while she waited for a response. So the last sentence there, she picked up her market basket and so on, is an action beat. So we are describing something that happens around things that people are saying. So this is an action beat. So this is where you describe things like he giggled, she shrugged, they walked across the room, they ran out of the room, she jumped for joy. Anything that people are doing around the dialogue. So these are called action beats. So, do you want to come to the market with me is the word said or the dialogue. Yarrow asked is the dialogue tag, and then she picked up her market basket from beside the door and checked it for holes while she waited for a response is an action beat. So these are the 3 elements of dialogue. This is like a vocabulary thing. We're going to continue to talk about these, so I wanted to make sure that we defined all 3 of these things. All right, so now I have some tips. So, the most important thing I'm going to tell you today, as far as dialogue goes, besides probably the definitions, is that dialogue is a representation, not a transcription of speech. Now, we've all now done transcriptions. A transcription is when you take the exact words that someone said and write them down. Of course, we were doing transcriptions from actors reading a screenplay. They're performing a screenplay. So there's already a little element of someone writing what they are saying, someone editing reality. But still, you get the basic idea. When you write down exactly what someone said, it is a transcription. Now, when we are writing dialogue for our characters, we are actually not transcribing what they say. We are trying to represent what they say. It is a representation of speech. In real life, people use lots of filler words like or like or you know. If someone is praying, they might be adding lots of thank you, Lord, or Lord, or Father, just lots and lots of filler words. When people are actually talking, they may use fragments. They may speak in long run-on sentences and just keep connecting their words with and, or but. They may talk in incorrect grammar in the sense of sometimes people start a sentence and then change their mind where the sentence is going and shift off. Now, a little bit of all of these things is okay, but when we're talking about a representation, not a transcription, we're talking about we want it to feel like real people talking. Generally, some genres of stories, it doesn't matter. If you're writing high fantasy, people actually sounding like real people is not important, really, or a fairy tale. But in general, we're trying to make it feel like real speech, but we want it to, in general, be more understandable, more readable, quicker to read, with less going back and starting things again, less filler, etc. So, I have some tips. In general, limit filler words. Once again, these are things like, and, you know. Anything can become a filler word if it's just being used to fill space. People use filler words because they're thinking. People use filler words so that people won't interrupt them. People use filler words just by habit because they hear other people doing it. There's lots of reasons to use filler words, and I personally don't think that they're a bad thing. They can make your dialogue clunky and sometimes hard to understand if you use too many of them. So I'm just going to recommend that you limit them. Make the ones you use count. Limit or omit onomatopoeia. Now again, this is just in dialogue. Onomatopoeia often sounds weird in dialogue. If I'm reading someone saying like H-A, 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 ha, 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 right? If I see that in dialogue, if it's inside the quotation marks, I am assuming that the person is saying ha, 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 not that they are laughing. In general, I find most onomatopoeia is best described outside of the actual quotation marks rather than written inside the quotation marks. I just feel it's more effective. This isn't a hard, fast rule. Once again, this is a tip. So I am just advising you to go, does the person actually say the onomatopoeia word, such as ha ha ha, he, grr? Are they actually saying that word, or are they making a sound that the onomatopoeia is representing? And in which case, there are probably more effective and prettier ways to talk about that sound. Now, once again, limit or omit. This isn't banning you from onomatopoeia, and we're certainly not banning it in outside of the dialogue. This is, again, just for things inside the quotation marks. Limit how often people address others by name. It is not common in English to use people's proper names. It just isn't. It's not something that we do very often. If you're writing in Japanese, this rule would not apply at all. Every tip that you're going to get in a writing class is going to be specific to the language that you're writing for the most part. Maybe some things about plot cross languages, but for the most part, every language has its own standards. So I'm just recommending that you don't have your character say, Sally, how are you today? Or Marge, I want you to know that I love you. It's just weird in English to repeatedly address someone by name unless you're trying to get their attention. So just watch that. That is my biggest beef with some TV shows, specifically, egregiously, I've noticed that in this TV show Supernatural. That's my biggest beef from back when I watched that as a high schooler, is that they would refer to each other by name all the time. And I'd be like, you two are the only two people in the room. Why are you constantly using each other's name? Who else are you talking to? So just, that's something to watch because it's not something that feels natural in English. All right. Limit the niceties of polite speech. This is the good mornings, the hellos, the how are you today, the weather is so nice today. Anything that people are generally starting out conversations with or ending conversations with. They get repetitive. They don't tend to move the story forward. So my recommendation is that you either skip them. If someone is calling someone on the phone, skip to the part where they start talking about the important stuff. Or sum up. Say, they said their hellos and then jump into what's important in the dialogue. Because, of course, the purpose of a dialogue scene is the same as the purpose of any scene. It is to push forward the story. And good mornings and hellos don't generally push forward the story. The exception is if you are trying to emphasize the boringness or the purposefulness of the relationship the two characters have, you might lean into this. But as I said, limit. This is a tip. Limit the niceties of polite speech. All right, don't info dump in dialogue. A good key that you are doing some unfortunate info dumping is a character saying, as you know, and then proceeding to give a big long speech to one character who already knows what they're saying. That's not the best way of giving information. Giving information in dialogue is a wonderful way to give information, but you really need to be crafting that scene very carefully. You need a character who truly does not know what's going on for it to make sense. So just watch that. Be careful with that. Either tell things in the narration, invent a character who doesn't know so that it makes sense to explain things. This is why a lot of times when you are reading a fantasy story about someone who is learning magic, someone who's doing magic, it's normally that they are truly learning how to do it, and that gives the audience the ability to then learn along with them how the world works, which can be very interesting and very engaging. But it helps to have a character who doesn't know what's going on. It can get boring very fast to info dump in the dialogue. All right, let your characters lie. This is the biggest revelation that I've had probably in the last 5 years of writing. It is very helpful in scenes for your characters not to be able to say the truth. Now, this doesn't always have to be malicious. They're not always necessarily trying to deceive one another, but giving your characters difficulties, such as they have thoughts that they can't put into words, or they're afraid to put into words, or otherwise they can't get out. But allowing your characters to not tell the complete truth is very helpful in stories. All right, our next bullet point is people have a tendency to speak in run-on sentences and fragments. Clean up your dialogue for clarity. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have your characters ever speak in a run-on sentence or a fragment. As this says, people do have a tendency to speak that way. What I am advising is that you clean up your dialogue for clarity. So don't use too many fragments, don't use too many run-on sentences. And when you are using either of them, make sure that your dialogue is still understandable and clear, that it still makes sense even with people speaking in run-on sentences or with them speaking in very short fragments. So just be aware. It's not something you can't do, but let's go ahead and clean it up a little bit so that it is always easy for the reader to understand what is going on. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit more about dialogue tags. I know that we already talked about dialogue tags and where you can put them when we were discussing punctuation, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about this particular topic. So, dialogue tags can go before dialogue, between bits of dialogue, or after dialogue. So, first, Lily said, "I've never seen you here before." The dialogue, the words actually said, we're just going to call that dialogue for the moment. The dialogue is, "I've never seen you here before." The dialogue tag is Lily said. Lily said, comma, "I've never seen you before." The dialogue tag is connected to the sentence that is said, the dialogue with a comma. Between bits of dialogue. "In all my years," Mrs. O'Neill exclaimed, "we've never seen such snowfall." "In all my years, I've never seen such snowfall" is the dialogue. It is all one sentence, and it is being interrupted by the dialogue tag, "Mrs. O'Neill exclaimed." So it is separated off, the dialogue tag is separated off with commas. "In all my years, comma, Mrs. O'Neill exclaimed, comma, I've never seen such snowfall." This dialogue tag is in between bits of dialogue, or after dialogue. "I want to go to Paris next year," Charles said. "I want to go to Paris next year" is the dialogue. "Charles said" is the dialogue tag. It is coming after. So since this is a sentence that would normally end with a period, "I want to go to Paris next year." It's not a question and it's not an exclamation. It is separated off from the dialogue tag with a comma. In general, you're going to be using commas to separate dialogue tags from the dialogue. When your dialogue tag is coming last, you do have the dilemma of, if it is a question or something that is being exclaimed, you may use an exclamation point or a question mark instead of a comma. This can make it look like you are separating off your dialogue, "I want to go to Paris next year," if you're making an exclamation, from "Charles said" or "Charles exclaimed," right? But it is actually, they're all the same. We're just making an exception for question marks and exclamation points. But normally, if it ends in a period, you're going to use a comma to connect it to the dialogue tag. You don't have to worry about this when the dialogue tag comes first. You don't have to worry about it when it comes in the middle. But when it comes at the end, you do have to think about, okay, this is a complete sentence. "I want to go to Paris next year." Normally, I'd put a period, but since I'm connecting it to a dialogue tag, I'm using a comma. Now, note, "In all my years," Mrs. O'Neill exclaimed, "we've never seen such snowfall." And then I want you to compare it to another example where a dialogue tag is coming in between two bits of dialogue. "We've never seen such snowfall," Mrs. O'Neill said. "I hope the cows are okay." Now, the difference between these two examples is, in the first, one sentence of dialogue, "In all my years we've never seen such snowfall," is interrupted by the dialogue tag, "Mrs. O'Neill exclaimed." In the second example, there are two different sentences of dialogue. "I've never seen such snowfall" and "I hope the cows are okay." These are two different sentences. So the dialogue tag is coming between them, but it is, as far as punctuation goes, the dialogue tag is actually punctuated like a dialogue tag that comes at the end. Alternatively, you could punctuate it like one in the beginning, but let's look at the one at the end first. "We've never seen such snowfall, comma, Mrs. O'Neill said," and then we put a big ol' period there, because "I've never seen such snowfall" is a complete sentence. So we're connecting it to a dialogue tag, "Mrs. O'Neill said," and then we're putting the period there. But then Mrs. O'Neill continues to talk. "I hope the cows are okay." This is a new sentence, so it gets to stand on its own. It actually doesn't have a dialogue tag connected to it. "I hope the cows are okay" we know that Mrs. O'Neill is continuing to speak because it's the same paragraph. So it's punctuated like a dialogue tag at the end of a bit of dialogue. You can connect them, actually, something in the middle, you can connect it to the one after. You could say, "I've never seen such snowfall, period. Mrs. O'Neill said, comma, I hope the cows are okay," which is how you would connect it to the second one. It doesn't really matter too much which one you connect it to when you're just using something like said. If you're using a stronger verb, it might change how the sentence is read or understood by your reader, which is good to keep in mind. But in general, I just wanted you to notice that there are two different ways of interrupting what someone has said with a dialogue tag, depending on whether you're interrupting one sentence or you're interrupting a series of sentences. All right, action beats or body language. So, an action beat is anything that someone can do around dialogue. So, this can be picking up paper, this can be writing something down, this can be pacing or throwing a ball or throwing a punch. But it can also be body language. And I think that even though all descriptions of body language, when someone is doing something with their face or their body, all of those are considered action beats, but I think they're very important action beats. So I wanted to go ahead and bring out specifically that action beats can be body language. All right, I wrote up some examples, so let's break them down. So the first one is, Camille set the teacup down with a clink and said, "I think it is time to depart." Now, let's go ahead and break down the parts of this little paragraph. I think it's time to depart is the dialogue. It's the words actually said. The dialogue tag is, this one's a little complicated because it is a compound sentence. So Camille said is the dialogue tag, but Camille did two different things here. Camille set the teacup down with a clink, and Camille said. So Camille set the teacup down with a clink is the action beat. She is setting the teacup down, and then we're describing the sound it makes. So this is an example of an action beat and a dialogue tag. They're kind of rolled together into this compound sentence, and they're done before the dialogue. Next, well then, Traverser said as he stood, shall we go? See here, this is an example of the dialogue tag being in the middle of one sentence. Well then, shall we go is the dialogue. Traverser said is the dialogue tag. As he stood is the action beat. He is standing up and talking at the same time. He is saying, well then, shall we go? And notice that since it's well then, shall we go is one sentence, it's separated off from the dialogue tag and action beat by commas here. Next, I, for one, would be happy to stay another hour, Pat said. She topped off her cup of tea from the pot in the middle of the table. I, for one, would be happy to stay another hour is the dialogue. Pat said is our dialogue tag. And then instead of making the dialogue tag and the action beat all in one sentence, we've actually put a period here and we've done a new sentence, which is our action beat. She topped off her cup of tea from the pot in the middle of the table as the action beat. So I've connected these two in the sense that they are in the same paragraph and it is the same actor doing them. Pat is saying and Pat is topping off her cup of tea, but they're not connected. You can connect them in the sense of I could have put a comma after said and said, and she topped off her cup of tea from the pot in the middle of the table. I could have used a semicolon after said to connect these two as well. But the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes action beats aren't connected to the dialogue tags and sometimes they are. And this is an example of a dialogue tag, a period, and then an action beat. Frowning, Camille said, I thought you never wanted to stay more than 15 minutes. I thought you never wanted to stay more than 15 minutes is the dialogue. Camille said is the dialogue tag, and then our action beat is actually the word frowning here, where it is very short and connected to the dialogue tag by a comma, but it is serving as our action beat. We are describing Camille's body language here. Pat shrugged. That was before I tasted the scones. That was before I tasted the scones is the dialogue. There is no dialogue tag. And then we have Pat shrugged is our action beat. It's going before. Now, technically, action beats don't serve as dialogue tags. But sometimes you do the same function in that sometimes you can use an action beat instead of a dialogue tag to tell the reader who is talking, which is the point of a dialogue tag. So Pat shrugged is an action. It is an action beat. It's a form of body language. And it is telling you here who is going to talk next. And it's just done by context. Pat shrugged. That was before I tasted the scones. It's all in one paragraph. And so that is suggesting to the reader that whatever comes next is connected to whatever came before. Pat shrugged, and then we have dialogue. It makes sense that the person who did the shrugging is then going to do the talking. That's why it's so important to remember to separate the actions of people from the words of other people. So if character A talks and then character B hits them, it's better, of course, to have character B hitting character A in a separate paragraph from what character A said, even if the reason the character B hit character A was because character A said something so rude that they lost their temper, right? It's still better to keep them separate, and that's because often action beats can tell you who's talking, just like a dialogue tag. And then the next one is similar. Traverser chuckled and sat back down. I suppose you should pass me one. Traverser chuckled and he sat back down is our action beat. I suppose you should pass me one is the dialogue, and there is no dialogue tag. Now, I did want to make a note about chuckled and giggled and laughed. Technically, you should not be using any of these as dialogue tags. Dialogue tags are, of course, the character who is talking and a word describing sound of words coming out of someone's mouth. It's very difficult to laugh and talk at the same time. Most of the time, people are laughing and then talking, or talking and then laughing, or laughing a little bit and talking a little bit, and laughing a little bit and talking a little bit. And in general, if you try to use laughed or chuckled or giggled as a dialogue tag, it implies that they are doing the talking and the giggling at the same time. Now, someone might manage a word or two while laughing, but a whole sentence is probably difficult for anyone to get out at the same time that they're laughing. If for nothing else, then it takes a lot of air to laugh and a lot of air to talk. You'd run out of air very quickly trying to do both at the same time. So, I don't recommend ever using chuckled, giggled, laughed as dialogue tags. In my opinion, it's better to treat them like action beats. That someone is chuckling. I mean, you might even say, so-and-so chuckled as they talked, which implies more of the, I'm talking a little bit, I'm getting a couple words out, I have a giggle, I get another couple more words out, I have a giggle, I get a couple more words out, etc., etc., where you're not actually making it a dialogue tag, where you're either describing Traverser chuckled and sat back down, and then going in and saying what they said, or you are saying while they laughed, as they laughed, with a laugh. All of these are acceptable action beats to connect to a traditional dialogue tag like said. Okay, some tips about action beats. The more body language you describe, the slower the dialogue will move. Now, this should just make logical sense to you, because the more words you use to write a scene, so if you have your dialogue and then you put lots of action beats around it, there will be more words. The more words you have to write a scene, the longer it'll take to read. And the longer it takes to read, the longer it feels to the reader. So this is just logical. Now, you can use this to your benefit. A very fast conversation, say, while two characters are racing down the street to confront a dragon wreaking havoc, will probably have no body language. I am pulling this example not from thin air, but from the book Guards Guards by Terry Pratchett, who we will talk about later, where he's actually describing two characters racing down the street to confront a dragon wreaking havoc. And it is a very fast scene because the characters are running and they're yelling at each other. And he actually uses no body language, no action beats, and no dialogue tags. Now, it did get a little confusing, I will confess, because it's like a whole page of the characters yelling back and forth at each other, and there are only two of them, but still, character A, character B, character A, character B, character A, character B, character A, character B. I did have to like go through and list that out to figure out some of the dialogue at the very end. But it was very effective regardless, because it really gave the impression of these choppy speech patterns of two desperate people running through the city. Meanwhile, a plotting conversation, perhaps one neither character wishes to be having, will probably have a lot of description of what the characters are doing and possibly what the viewpoint character is thinking. When the conversation is not going anywhere fast, you can convey that by a lot of description around what people are saying. Because once again, the longer it takes to read, the longer the scene feels. So it's very effective to control how fast the scene feels. And it's something you should use to your benefit. And also keep in mind, if you want the scene to feel fast and it doesn't feel fast, what you may need to look at is where you've put your action beats, where you've put your dialogue tags, how much description you've added to the scene. All right, now we're going to read an excerpt from Chapter 1 of Going Postal by Terry Pratchett. Now, this isn't the very, very beginning of Chapter 1, but in general, I don't consider anything from Chapter 1 to be a spoiler, personally. I mean, I often will read Chapter 1 in the bookstore when I'm trying to decide whether to buy a book. So this is from Chapter 1, and to give you some context, the main character of the book, whose name is Moist, love it or hate it, that's his name, he hates it for reference, has been arrested for being a con man and been sentenced to hang. And the book opens with him sort of contemplating how he got there and where he is, and then we go into this scene when it's the morning of his demise. And now it was a few minutes before dawn, and it was him being led down the short corridor and out into the little room under the scaffold. Moist realized he was looking at himself from a distance, as if part of himself was floating outside of his body like a child's balloon, ready as it were for him to let go of the string. The room was lit by light coming through cracks in the scaffold floor above, and significantly from around the edges of a large trap door. The hinges of said door were being carefully oiled by a man in a hood. He stopped when he saw the party had arrived and said, "Good morning, Mr. Spangler." He raised the hood helpfully. "It's me, sir, Daniel One-Drop Trooper. I'm your executioner for today, sir. Don't you worry, sir. I've hanged dozens of people. We'll soon have you out of here." "Is it true that if a man isn't hanged after 3 attempts, he's reprieved, Dan?" said Moist, as the executioner carefully wiped his hands on a rag. "So I've heard, sir, so I've heard, but they don't call me One Drop for nothing, sir. And will sir be having the black bag today?" "Will it help?" "Some people think it makes them look more dashing, sir, and it stops that pop-eyed look. It's more a crowd thing, really. Quite a big one out there this morning. Nice piece about you in the Times yesterday, I thought. All them people saying what a nice young man you were and everything. Would you mind signing the rope beforehand, sir? I mean, I won't have a chance to ask you afterwards, eh?" "Signing the rope?" said Moist. "Yes, sir," said the hangman. "It's sort of traditional. There's a lot of people out there who buy old rope. Specialist collectors, you could say. A bit strange, but it takes all sorts, eh? Worth more signed, of course." He flourished a length of stout rope. "I've got a special pen that signs on rope. 1 signature every couple of inches. Straightforward signature, no dedication needed. Worth money to me, sir. I'd be very grateful." "So grateful you won't hang me, then," said Moist, taking the pen. This got an appreciative laugh. Mr. Trooper watched him sign along the length, nodding happily. "Well done, sir. That's my pension plan you're signing there. Now, are we ready, everyone? Not me, said Moist quickly, to another round of general amusement. You're a card, Mr. Spangler, said Mr. Wilkinson. It won't be the same around without you around, that's the truth. Not for me, any rate, said Moist. This was once again treated like rapier wit. Moist sighed. Do you really think all this deters crime, Mr. Trooper? He said. Well, in the generality of things, I'd say it's hard to tell, given that it's hard to find evidence of crimes not committed, said the hangman, giving the trapdoor a final rattle. But in the specificality, sir, I'd say it's very efficacious. Meaning what? Said Moist. Meaning I've never seen someone up here more'n once, sir. Shall we go? All right. Now, I don't know if you have guessed, but Moist does not, of course, die in this particular scene. He goes on to continue being the main character for the rest of the book. But I wanted to go ahead and point out a couple things about this scene that is primarily a dialogue scene. Now, Terry Pratchett opens this whole scene with a sense of where the main character is, like, in his mental state, and a brief description of where they are. Pratchett's dialogues tend to be very pared down. He doesn't do a lot of description in the middle of his dialogue scenes. He has very sparkling dialogue scenes, but he relies a lot on his very skillful way of writing what people actually are saying. But that doesn't mean that he ignores things like description and like the internal world of his main characters altogether. Now, he's not saying Moist thought this or Moist thought that, but he is giving you the impression of his kind of disconnect from his body in this scene. The whole metaphor about him feeling like he was floating outside of his body like a child's balloon, ready to be let go of, where he's feeling very distanced. He is coming to terms with his upcoming death, and I don't know that it has completely sunk in yet, to be honest, where he's there, but he's not there. And then, of course, we get a description, very brief, but enough to give you a picture of where it's going, of them coming into the little room, being lit from above, but it's kind of in the shadows, and then there is this ominous light coming from around the edges of the trapdoor, where, of course, Moist will be put above and then dropped into his death. And then he has the humorous conversation with his hangman. So, I want you to notice, as I may have already said, I think Pratchett is one of the best dialogue writers I have ever personally read. I love how he is interweaving the personality of the characters and the actions of the characters with his dialogue. He tends to have very basic, very boring dialogue tags. He often will use said, even when characters are asking a question or of anything of that sort. He doesn't focus a lot on that, but he does a lot of really great action beats. I'm thinking of the hangman flourishing the rope that he wants Moist to sign, for example, is just very evocative. You can really see what's going on, and it continues to give you this sense of the almost unreality of this whole situation, which I think Pratchett is trying to convey. That it's a very serious thing to be happening to Moist. He's about to be hanged, but I don't think the reader is supposed to feel a whole lot of doom and gloom about it. Alright, for homework this week, I want you to revise the dialogue that you wrote 2 weeks ago. So you should have gotten it back with the corrections. So first, I want you to review the comments made by your teachers, and I want you to look at where we've corrected punctuation and grammar and make sure that you are going ahead and fixing that in your revision. And then also any advice that we have given you when you are revising. And next I want you to revise the scene or rewrite the scene, making sure to expand on what you already wrote. So make sure you are using action beats, but also ask yourself what your characters are thinking, feeling, seeing, touching. I know you worked a lot on using figurative language this semester, and I want to see it. Show, don't tell still applies. Your finished scene should be no less than 2 full pages, all the way to the end of the page. So we're kind of taking the initial dialogue you wrote, like it is kind of a flat balloon, and we're plugging it into an air pump. And this week, I want you to pump, 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 pump it up. So make the corrections we asked for, take the advice that we gave you, and expand on the scene. That's why I was focusing on some things that I liked about how Terry Pratchett started his dialogue scene, because a lot of you had what we like to call floating heads in a white room syndrome. Now, this is not a rare issue to have. This is very, very common. So I don't want you to worry that, oh no, I'm just a terrible writer because I had this problem. Many people have this problem. It's one of the most common problems that writers face. So, what is it? Floating heads in a white room syndrome is when your characters are talking, but there is no description of where they are or what they're doing or really anything to give the readers a good image in their head of the scene. They're reading the scene, they're hearing the dialogue, but they're not really getting enough out of it to be able to paint a mental picture of what's happening. It's like imagining just a floating head in a white room. There's nothing going on. And so my little heads say, "How are you today, Deborah?" And "The Lord is good, Chad." It's not giving us a lot, is it? It's not giving us a lot. So, how do you fix floating heads in a white room syndrome? Well, you're going to do things like opening with a description of where the characters are. As we saw that in the excerpt we read from Going Postal, where we started with the idea of Moist's mental state at the beginning, and then also where they were walking in. Now, as I said, Pratchett tends to be a very sparse writer when it comes to like things in his dialogues. He often goes on for long philosophical like bunny trails and in his narrative, but when he's writing dialogue, he tends to focus a lot on what people are actually saying. But that doesn't mean he leaves us hanging. So he created very quickly for us this concept of the disassociation that Moist is struggling with and the gloomy, doomy scene that he is being led into, this tiny room under the scaffold. And I think significantly to the themes of the book, the light is coming from this scaffold. Now you'll have to read the book to understand what that means, but I don't know if Pratchett meant that symbolically, but oh, it works so well. The light in this room is only coming from the scaffold, from where it's peeking through the holes in the scaffold, and it's brilliant. It's wonderful. Anyway, but it gives us a very brief image of what's going on, and so that's something that you can do in your writing. If you didn't really describe where your characters were talking, putting just a single paragraph at the very beginning describing where the scene is taking place, very helpful. Quick, easy fix. Now, some of you started scenes where someone is like bursting in and talking to someone else. Now, it is totally fine to go ahead and start with the dialogue in that case, but then go ahead and describe real quick where they're bursting into and what they're bursting in on, and then keep talking. And then keep the talking going, and then have the reactions of the other characters. And that's another thing that I want to see. I want to see, what are the other characters doing? What are they thinking? What are they feeling when someone's talking? Some of you chose characters giving more speeches, but none of those characters, as far as I can remember, were absolutely alone when they were talking. So I want to know, what are their listeners doing? What are they thinking? And then also more of what your main character, whoever is talking, what are they thinking, feeling, touching, seeing, smelling as they are talking? So that will help you overcome this white room syndrome, because we are now painting a picture of where this dialogue is taking place. So I just wanted to go ahead and talk about that when you're asking yourself, how can I flesh out this scene? I have done all the punctuation edits they asked me to. Now what? So, describing where they are, describing the other characters in the scene, and then describing what they're doing, using more of these action beats to describe what's happening. If they are describing their body language, describing their thoughts, their feelings around the dialogue, describing, are they standing up, are they sitting down, what are they doing with their hands. All of these action beats also will help you flesh it out, pump it up, make it really great. All right, and that's it.